the whole of Ukraine could collapse in the face of its military defeat at the hands of Russia. Maybe at that point, European politicians, or at least some of them, will come to their senses and start to see things differently, and get more in tune with the American perspective on the war, which is which is that the war needs to come to an end as soon as possible. That there's no future in continuing to fight the war. That actually it remains an existentially dangerous war. Europeans are not there. They're still on the previous wavelength for as long as it takes to keep the Ukrainians fighting. Wear the Russians down, and all this kind of like talk about the Russian threat, expansionism, and after Ukraine it'll be the Baltic states and Poland. All this kind of like nonsense. They're still in that space.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Geoffrey Roberts, an Emeritus Professor from the University College Cork in Ireland. Geoff is a British historian, biographer and political commentator, a specialist in Russian and Soviet foreign and military policy, and an expert on Stalin and the Second World War. His most recent work is this lovely book over here, called Stalin's Library, a dictator and his books, of course, because it's a library. Geoff is one of the critical Western historians who also dares to speak his mind when it comes to the war in Ukraine, something that has been criticized rather strongly also recently. And we want to discuss this, the Ukraine, the war, and how things are developing. So, Geoff, welcome.
Hi, Pascal. Good to see you again, and many thanks for the invitation.
Well, many thanks for coming online, and also thanks for writing this fantastic book. I have it here in my library all the time, because you really went for many years through the catalog of books that we know that Stalin had, right? Can you maybe tell us a little bit why you took that project on and what you've learned about this dictator and how and why he was so much into books?
Yeah. Actually, the timing of this interview is quite good, because the paperback edition of Stalin's Library is just about to be published in a couple of months' time. So, obviously a much more affordable price. Why Stalin read a lot of books? That's a very easy question to answer. Actually, he read a lot of books the same reason that we read a lot of books. Yes, he was an intellectual, and that's what intellectuals do. They read. Yes. Stalin's read more than books, of course, read all kinds of different things, yeah. But books were central to his life as an intellectual. And why I wrote the book was because obviously the idea that Stalin was an intellectual who read books was not particularly original idea or a novel idea. Of course, that was the case. But what happened was that a good part of his library, his personal library, his personal book collection survived, in the archives, So we have access to his personal book collection, or at least a remnant of it. So we know what books were in his library, and on the basis of the remnant, we can actually calculate the total volume of his library. And in several hundred cases, we know for sure that he read those books because he marked them in some way. And it's how he marked them, what he wrote in them, is the thing that first attracted me to this source. Because, of course, when he's reading his books, he's very much, he's reading and he's marking his books for himself. Yeah. So it's the most kind of intimate reflection of Stalin's thinking and feeling in relation to a particular text that we have. Of course, we have a huge amount of other texts that Stalin marked, but these are things that he was marking in a kind of semi-public way, for his secretaries or for his Politburo comrades, thing like this. So this is by far the most intimate source we have in relation to Stalin. The books that he read, how he read them, and how he marked them. Okay, so that was the attraction. And the time I took on the project, all these books, at least the ones he'd marked, several hundred books, were supposed to be digitized. So I would be able to I wouldn't have to go to Moscow to the archive. I'd be able to do research at home. Well, what happened was only a third of the books were digitized, which meant that I had to go to Moscow and look at the other two-thirds in the library, which wasn't such a bad thing to do, because there's things that you miss if you're just dealing with digital images. Yeah, there's no substitute for having the actual books themselves in your hands, and yeah, there's stuff you can learn from that you won't find out from the digital images. Okay, so the effect of that was that it became it's supposed to be 2, 3, maybe 4-year project, but it turned into a decade, a decade-long project, and and the book was published in February 2022.
The very prophetic time, actually. And I mean, your connection with Russia as a historian of Russia's past, of Stalin and so on, you have a long perspective on the relationship between Russia and the West. When then the relationship spiraled ever further into into confrontation, how did you perceive this time, and how did it impact you, who still had to go and do research in Moscow?
You're talking about in the recent period, yeah?
Before 2022 and then also after. I mean, after
Yeah.
everything changed the way that we could interact with Russia. But even
Yeah,
before, the
yeah.
relationship wasn't a good one ever since 2014, was it?
Okay. There were obviously post break of the Ukraine war. There was a deterioration in Russia's relations with the West, a radical deterioration, obviously. But that wasn't the first time there'd been quite a substantial deterioration. So in one sense, it wasn't a new scenario, this collapse in Soviet Russian Western relations, but obviously it was much more extreme than it had been in the past. So I mean, when the war broke out, I was in Poland. I was actually the day of the special military operation was launched. I was in Auschwitz. I was visiting Auschwitz, so I was actually viewing Auschwitz, and at the same time we were getting all this news coming over on our phones about the launch of the special military operation. So it was actually quite a kind of emotional time. I wasn't that surprised by the fact of military action. I was surprised subsequently by the scale of it, but I was still shocked by it, emotionally. And my book had just been published, right? It was just about to be published, so I kind of had the option of just focusing on my book, Stalin's Library, and promoting the book and review, and then start to write the next book. But I felt duty bound to actually involve myself in the public discussion about the Ukraine war, and to bring to bear my knowledge of Russia, my knowledge of Russian and Soviet history, and also to a certain extent my knowledge of military affairs, and I felt duty bound to that. Okay, because I had this expertise to offer, and also I'm a historian, but I had dabbled a bit in current affairs commentary before 2022, not very much, but also there was this torrent. I don't know. It's hard to find a word. Avalanche, of propaganda, of Russophobia, anti-Russia, anti-Putin, completely one-sided narrative of the war, its origins, and what was going on. And I felt I just had to push back against that, and insist that we needed to take as truthful and as objective perspective on the war as was possible. Very difficult, obviously difficult because it's an ongoing event, and also difficult because the sources we have at our disposal are very problematic. Yeah. So I felt duty bound to get involved, and also to use my particular skills as a historian to contribute in a particular way to this discussion. So one of the first things I did, I sat down to work out why Putin had taken this momentous decision to invade Ukraine. Because, however way you look at it, if it's right or wrong, certainly a very radical decision, dangerous decision, risky decision. Not the kind of thing you'd have expected Putin to do, actually. But why? So why did he do it? So then I worked on, and I wrote this article called "Now or Never: The Immediate Origins of Putin's Preventative War on Ukraine." So throughout this whole since 2022, okay, I have a position on the war. I have a political position, which is basically a pro-peace position, by the way. But I've also been trying to engage with the discussion, with the debate, in such a way as to let to contribute to it as a scholar, as well as someone with a particular point of view, to share my knowledge and expertise. So when I get involved in discussions about the world, sometimes quite kind of polemical discussions, I'm always very careful not to put my scholarship to one side. My scholarly values, my commitment to truth, objectivity, dealing with all the evidence and all the arguments as fairly as I can, and being critically self-reflective. That is always at the forefront of my mind as well.
And that's what good scholarship should be like, right? We should
Absolutely.
be guided. We should be guided by the search for truth, as in what happened, and then explain why this happened, and understand that things are multi-causal and have multiple effects, right? And not narrow it down into one stream of thinking, because we've seen that, and I've been surprised by how many historians in the West actually immediately went into this very simple narrative of Vladimir Putin. It wants to bring back the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, one of the two, whatever it is, but it's all about conquest. And they immediately ignored all of the other evidence, the historical evidence that we have that suggests, look, this is way more difficult than what you're trying to portray here. And it's also a narrative of fear that you're trying to portray in order, again, to demonize the Russian side. Now they're saying that the Russians are a holy people or can do no wrong. Of course, wouldn't be right either. But there was this weird moment, and I must maybe also say that people, and I belong to them, I didn't believe that Russia would invade. I thought that was a propaganda ploy, again, first and foremost because I thought that the special military operation, going militarily into Ukraine, would just hurt Russia too much, because these are, again, the Russians, Putin himself spoke time and again of a brotherly people, right? And then the military operation happened anyhow, but a lot of things happened over the last 3 years. How did you make sense of it at the time? I mean, I was genuinely surprised, because I thought Russia wouldn't be able to, do that level of intervention, but then they did. So how did you make sense of it? Because it's also easy to forget that we start to remember things differently after a certain period of time. Things feel different at the moment than they do when we look back at them.
Sure, which is why I always rely on documents, actually written materials, the text. They're the only reliable source. So if people want to reconstruct my perspective, last 3 years, what you need to do is read what I've written. I've published lots of stuff, so it's all out there. So be very skeptical about anything I say, including what I'm going to say now. Okay, but my memory is that. I remember thinking in December 2021, when Putin presented his security proposals to the West, yes, my thought was he's backed himself into a corner. If the West rebuffs these proposals, then he's going to have to do something. And that something is going to have to be some kind of military action, some kind of escalation of the situation. And of course, fundamentally, the West did rebuff the proposals, so Putin had to do something, and he did. So in that sense, I was, as I said, I was shocked, but I wasn't that surprised. Now the question is, what was he doing? And actually, it took quite a while for me to clarify in my own mind about what the purpose of the special military operation was, because there are all these kind of claims floating around as to what Putin intended in relation to to Ukraine and what the expectations were in regard to the military operation. But the conclusion I came to, after a few months, was that basically the aim of the military operation was to try to achieve by military means what he'd failed to achieve through diplomacy. And of course, the diplomacy he pursued before the war started was a kind of what you might call coercive diplomacy or militarized diplomacy. That's to say, he was making demands for negotiations, making proposals, but he was backing out by building up military forces and also obviously the threat of military action. So I came to see the actual the war itself has been an extension of that coercive diplomacy, quite a radical extension. So the idea, the aim was to actually, to force Ukraine and the West to actually negotiate a security deal along the lines of one that he proposed in December 21, and that was the whole meaning of the now famous peace negotiations in Istanbul. From the Russian point of view, from Putin's point of view, those negotiations were all about trying to force Ukrainians and the West to actually accept a deal which protected Russia's security, basically neutralization of Ukraine, disarmament of Ukraine, no further NATO expansion, all of that kind of thing, which 3 years later, that's basically the Russian position. Putin's position remains exactly the same. Okay, he wants more of it now because we've had 3 years of warfare, but it's the same position. Okay, so that was the intention, but of course, as we know, there was a major miscalculation there. There was a miscalculation in relation to Ukraine, its fighting abilities, and its resoluteness. When invaded, and also a miscalculation about the extent to which the West would weigh in on the Ukrainian side and be prepared actually to wage quite a very dangerous proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. So I think it was intended to be a short, sharp war to actually achieve relatively limited political diplomatic goals, but obviously it's turned into this much more prolonged conflict.
I had this discussion with Professor David Gibbs, who really very brilliantly made a parallel between how what happened in Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the Afghanistan War, 79 to 88, 89, and the Ukraine War. And he basically says that it is pretty clear that the United States had an intention to actually, or at least certain parts of the US, especially people, the neocon faction around Hillary Clinton, the people who outrightly said, let's make Ukraine the Afghanistan of Europe. And he has enough documents to prove that the United States was working already in Afghanistan to bait the Soviet Union into an invasion. And in a sense, we have a very similar situation. We have this similar situation in Ukraine, and we know by now from sources, even published by the New York Times, how long and how deep the involvement of the U.S. security state, especially of the CIA, with Ukraine is, and hence this puts a new perspective also on what probably Russia was able to know about how deep this NATOization, this slow securitization of Ukraine went over many years, even before 2014. Do you think that these revelations that we've read about now kind of also adjust again our understanding of why Russia decided to go to military means?
I think we need more information, more actual evidence before we can arrive at any firm conclusions. yeah, but obviously it's clear that there was a process of NATOization going on in relation to Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't a member of NATO. There were no short-term prospects of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. But in practicality, de facto, Ukraine was being integrated into Western, military political strate. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, and that's the danger that Putin saw. And okay, again, I can't be certain because I'm only basing on what the public evidence of Putin's intentions or calculations, right? But what the public evidence shows is that, that's the process that Putin saw, and he saw it as being dangerous to Russia. Not immediately, but in the longer term, and he calculated that a preventative war was a safer course of action than just waiting for the threat to fully materialize. Now, there are people who make this claim that it wasn't so much a preventative war; it was a preemptive strike. That's to say, the Ukrainians were planning an attack in the Donbass, and the Russians beat them to the punch. That's an argument that comes up on a regular basis. But look, I don't see any actual evidence that was the case. Yeah, the Ukrainians were building up their armed forces, just like the Russians were. Yes, there were intentions forming for future military action, I think, to actually secure the return of the Donbass and perhaps even of Crimea. But I don't see any evidence that the Ukrainians had any immediate intentions to initiate military hostilities. And the Russian government itself has never ever officially claimed that their action was a preemptive strike. And if that was the case, and if they have evidence that the Ukrainians were just about to attack the Donbass, they would have said that, but clearly, and we would know about that. No, Putin has been very, very careful in his kind of like discourse about the war to make it clear that what he was dealing with was a future military threat to Russian security in the form of a NATOized Ukraine, not an immediate one. And his argument is, he still sticks to it to this very day, was that it was better to take action in February 22 rather than delay when the situation could be much worse from the Russian point of view. But look, but just go back to which way. Look, we need to have more evidence before we can arrive at some firm conclusions. Now, you mentioned Afghanistan. Wow, the thing about Afghanistan and the Soviet involvement, we have lots of evidence, a huge amount of evidence, so we can come to some very firmly grounded conclusions about that. So we know that the Soviet leadership was very reluctant to take military action. Right? We know that the military operation that they launched was supposed to be a special operation, not the launch of a war. In Afghanistan, they didn't intend to get drawn into war, and we also know again, this is evidence based that actually, the Soviet war in Afghanistan wasn't such a disaster as it was made out to be in Western propaganda. The disastrous war in Afghanistan, of course, occurred when the West, NATO, United States, when they invaded Ukraine in 2002, and the 20-year war that ensued after, and that was the disastrous war in Afghanistan, not the Soviet military intervention.
Yeah, but we when we do history, we have this frustrating problem that we need to wait 30, 40, 50 years until we get our hands on the documents. And by the time you get them, you get to have all of the conclusions. But it's long gone, right? And we know that these people who hold power, that's something that they gamble with, right? It was like, because the only thing, the thing they care most about is the current 6 weeks, because everything older is then history, and it doesn't really impact you anymore what you can do.
But what politicians also do is that they also frequently over-rationalize and lend self-serving coherence to their actions, right? which actually is a retrospective kind of thing, isn't actually true at the time. And the problem is people tend to read politicians' self-serving claims as actually being reflecting the reality, right? And there's an example of that. And again, I'm not sure about this, and I'm sure you might want to push back against. We had this this famous thing where was it Merkel and
Hollande.
Yeah, Hollande. They both came out and said, yeah, well, of course, we didn't really we didn't really agree with the Minsk agreements. This was just a ploy to buy Ukraine time to actually build up its military forces to protect against a future Russian attack. Now, the question I ask is, that's what they say now, like after the war's out, well, war is waging, when they're being attacked, they're being criticized for being appeasers in relation to Russia and the Minsk agreements, right? Was that what they really thought at the time? I actually don't think so. I think at the time, they would, the French and German commitment to Minsk was quite genuine. But the problem was it was a very weak commitment. They weren't willing to do what was necessary to pressurize the Ukrainians into actually, actually turning the Minsk agreements into a long-term peace peace assessment. But I don't know. I could be wrong. As you say, we'll have to wait 20, 30, 40 years maybe before we can actually resolve that particular argument.
No. I actually think so too. I have another guest on my channel, Thomas Fazzi, who read the memoirs of Angela Merkel, and he said, look, it seems that she was actually surprisingly well informed about what happened in Ukraine, and she was surprisingly aware. So probably at the time she actually meant it, and then later, when she was being criticized for being too weak, she would put out that statement, "Oh, we just wanted to buy time." And funnily enough, that's exactly what also Vladimir Putin now repeats and says, like, "Oh, they betrayed me," because that now serves him as well, right? In order to portray the situation. So for opposite reasons, we now have two camps basically pointing out the same evidence, not contradicting each other, but working with what they say. It reminds me very much of how, like, sometimes for interesting coincidences, two sides of a story or two sides of a war can agree on some things. Like right now, the Taiwan and China, Taiwan and the mainland, both of them, constantly, systematically, do not talk about the fact that Taiwan is the Republic of China. The Republic of China is being forgotten, but for different reasons, because the Taiwanese would rather have their own Taiwanese identity, and the mainland China, the People's Republic, would like to say, like, no, the Republic ceased existing, right? So, but both of them have no intention to remind us that actually we still have a Republic of China, and we sometimes in these things that we forget, or the things that are not being talked about, are even more important to reconstruct history than the ones that are being debated. For the Russia-Ukraine war, for instance, that Vladimir Putin for 8 years wanted to keep the Donbas republics inside Ukraine. That is constantly forgotten by the West, and I wonder if it's possible to bring that back to the European awareness.
Well, not just, in the 8 years between 2014 to 2022, but also after the war had started, into the Istanbul Accords. Well, it was in March, April 2022, 6 months before the Donbass and also Kherson and Zaporozhye was incorporated into the Russian Federation. Until you get to the late summer, early autumn of 2022, there was no question of that happening. In the spring of 22, in Istanbul context, what was going to happen is that the Donbass republics weren't going to become part of Russia. They were going to remain independent, and there were the issue hadn't been resolved, but there were like discussions about how at some point in the future, on a voluntary basis, the Donbass Donetsk and Lugansk could actually be reunited with Ukraine. And so that's the deal that Putin was prepared to make in spring 2022, provided he got what he wanted, of course, in terms of Ukrainian neutrality, no more NATO expansion, and also safeguards for the rights of Russian speakers, not just in the Donbass, but in the whole of Ukraine. Yeah. So the point you made is a very good one, I think.
Yeah, because I mean, he only recognized the independence of these two republics like 2 or 3 days before the special military operation, or actually on the day. So for the longest time,
it's on the day, and the point about that was to provide a legal rationale for the special military operation, because they recognized their independence. Then they immediately signed defense pacts with the two states, and then the special military operation is launched to protect Donetsk and Lugansk from Ukrainian attacks, right? And that that's claimed to be a legitimate action under the UN Charter in self-defense, right? And of course, Putin, having this background as a lawyer, he was a law student. He's very, very keen. Everything he does, Russia does, has some kind of legal rationale or legal figure. But it's still, it's that wasn't the reason he did it. It wasn't to. He wants to protect the Donbass from Ukrainian attacks for sure, but it's a much more fundamental security problem that Putin is trying to deal with via Ukraine's NATOization, right? And that's why he takes this very radical step of actually invading Ukraine.
I see it the same way, and I just wonder if, then looking at all the massive flood of propaganda in the West about how we are supposed to think about what happened, even with all of this evidence that we can bring forward also as historians and say like, no, look, we have the original documents, right? And it's not even that difficult. A lot of this is actually floating out in the open, not the secret ones, of course, but especially the publicly negotiated part, like these treaties, these draft treaties. Why is it that in a open society, or a society that believes it's open, like the West, it's then so difficult to actually get some reality and realism into a public discourse?
Before I respond to that directly, I just might want to make another point. That what's amazed me is the resistance of people, particularly at the popular level, to all this propaganda and this pro-war, pro-Ukraine narrative. Because all the way through the war, there's been significant numbers of people who have been skeptical about all this propaganda and have been to one degree or another anti-war and pro-peace. And of course, the numbers of people who now want to see an end to the war, on a negotiated basis, a compromised peace, and so on.
We're having a lively discussion here. We're having a lively discussion, but continue.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, right, yes. Okay, yeah, the propaganda hasn't been as effective, I'm talking about on public opinion, as you might expect it to be, given its huge kind of dimensions. And okay, there is pushback, there's resistance, people like me, there's people like you, there are people out there, and also having the internet available is hugely important as having an alternative means of communicating, different and critical views, right? But actually, I suppose the question is, why aren't there more people like us? Yeah, there's surprisingly few people. If we just say academics.
I mean, which does beg the question. I mean, are we wrong? I mean, are we the ones who got? I mean, how would we know?
It's a question I ask myself every day, and have been asking myself every day since the war began. Maybe I'm the one who's crazy. Maybe I'm the one who's not seeing it. Maybe I'm a dupe of Russian propaganda. Maybe I'm reading. It's okay. It's got less as time has gone on, as the situation's clarified it and so on. But yeah, absolutely. It's a question I'm still asking myself all the time. But in the end, you have to call it
Yeah.
as you see it. You have
Yeah.
to sort of make up your mind. You obviously need to be very self-critical, reflective, and see into your own motivations and so on. But in the end, you have to you have to make a decision about what you're going to do and what you're going to say. But in terms of why aren't there more people like Ukraine war? What war was particularly was, but still is, of course, a hugely emotional issue. Yeah. So I think that a response of a lot of people you think would know better, should know better, is a very kind of like emotional response. Yeah. That's one point. The second point is that there is this one brutal fact about the war that you can't argue your way around or bypass, and that's the fact that it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. I mean, that's and many people just can't get beyond that brute fact. Okay, we can say it's not as simple as that. There was provocation. It's a very complicated story in lots, but there is that brute fact, and then associated is the idea that once you start trying to explain things, yes, you're playing into the hands of Russian propaganda. You're coming up with excuses and that kind of thing. So in response to that, people, the emotionality of it, it's a difficult issue because the Russians did invade, and the apprehension about being seen as being pro-Putin or pro-Russia, what Putin fish there, yeah, one of those people tend to go along with the mainstream narrative, or even if they're not happy about that, just to to keep their own counsel.
Yeah, and just to the previous point, it's also quite important that we can't escape ourselves, right? We're condemned to believing our own opinions. That's the one opinion we can't ignore. And and the other one forward is just also, yeah, I mean, because I think it's important. I think we need to doubt ourselves. That's the most important duty we've got. But
Sure,
we have to overcome. I mean, we must overcome it somehow, or we always do. But one thing is that we have also developed explanations, haven't we, in the West, for why some people like you and I, why these nuts don't agree. And funnily enough, we also started somehow, or by we, I mean the West, Western thinkers and Western media, propaganda, started demonizing the idea of understanding the rationale for Russia to do what it did that was different from their rationale. When they explained that Putin is an imperialist and wants to take over all of Europe, then they say that's good analysis. But when somebody says no, this is multi-causal, this has a long history and pedigree and so on and so forth, then you were accused of justifying. When in fact what we did is to explain, or what we believed was going on. And so understanding or digging down into the possible reasons suddenly became something dirty, something pro-Russian. And I haven't seen that before. Or have you? Can you remember another time when trying to understand the reasons for a world event was so demonized?
But it always happens in war situations, isn't it? The cliche about truth is the first casualty of war. It's a cliche, but it's also true. And the kind of stuff that we've been experiencing, people during the Second World War went through, during the First World War, during the Korean War, all kinds of wars. So it's not that that surprising that way. It's actually it's so massive, intense. I mean, that's the thing. That's certainly something about it that's different from in the past. But when people people are when you try and you're trying to explain something, and you're getting a very hostile response to it. What's happening there? People are they're just playing propaganda games. They have a propaganda line. They have an agenda. They want to push pre-existing point of view, and they're not going to allow you to actually disrupt that or undermine that. So therefore you get pushed back on that. Okay, which is okay, and that's something you need to be prepared for. when you engage in these public debates. And my approach is always the same. When I'm like interviewed or wherever, I always say, look, I'm here to give you the Russian point of view. You might see them as being aggressive and imperialist and expansionist, but that's not the way they see themselves, right? And it's the way they see themselves is what motivates what they do, what their action. And if we want to relate to them, right? Particularly if we want to bring the war to an end, peace, stable peace, then we have to see what that point of view is. So that's what I always do. But then of course that's what historians do. I mean, being a historian is getting beyond your own point of view and seeing other people's point of view, multiple point of views, and obviously having being committed to having the ability to actually put those together into a coherent kind of narrative, a story about the particular thing you're telling a story about, which then constitutes an explanation of that particular event or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and one thing that is always
important. Being a historian is the most important protection against all this stuff. For me, it's been my professional background as a historian, yeah, and the professional and scholarly commitments that I've embraced over this, and also I've practiced. I've actually, it's this kind of stuff has become part of me. You read all of everything I write about history. Stalin's library, for example. Agree or disagree, it's always from that perspective of explaining different points of view on the basis of the available evidence.
That's the right thing to do, and it's like it's sometimes also underestimated just how important it also is to try to understand what certain actors knew at certain points, right? What kind of information were they aware of? What kind of information was available to Russia about the state of NATOization of Ukraine? What kind of information was available in Washington about how much Russia knew? How much did Washington itself know about the state of NATOization? And was that actually deliberately used or accidentally used? And these details, they matter quite a lot, don't they?
Absolutely, but until we get a lot more hard documentation, it's we're in the realm of speculation, aren't we? And it's inescapable. And the problem with the realm of speculation is that you get some things right, but you also get some things wrong, don't you?
Yeah.
And I've certainly speculated wrongly many times in the last 3 years.
Yeah, but we are condemned to speculation, right? Because otherwise we can't even start to try to make sense of stuff. One of the things that I try to make sense of. If
you want to be a political, okay. I'm a historian, but I'm also a citizen. And in the context of the discussion we're having, I'm an activist, a political activist. Yes. If you're going to be a political activist, then it's very future oriented. It's all about speculation about the future, about what might happen in the future, or the possibilities you could create in the present, how you can actually create the future. You can't engage with politics without being engaging in speculation. Yeah. So if you don't want to do that, then don't get involved in politics. Just stick to history. Yeah, or
which is actually the safe thing to do. Sticking to history is safe.
And actually, that's what a lot of our colleagues have actually done. And in a way, I'm kind of like, I can't say I blame them. Actually, I can understand why they did it, and also because a very important point out, it just doesn't apply to you. But for me personally, okay, so I'm retired from academia. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm on a pension. Yeah, so I have a lot more freedom of action in this situation than people still have a job, a career. Yeah. I can understand how that they must feel very constrained about what they can say and do. So I'm very loath to criticize. Anyway, and hugely admiring of actually people like yourself, Pascal, who are still in their careers, in the midst of their careers, and are prepared to speak out on this very difficult issue.
I'm protected in a different way by being in Japan, and Japan actually being pretty like very strongly strong
Right.
behind academic freedom and not hot. They are not hot about Ukraine, in the sense that the
Yeah.
emotions are not boiling. The
Yeah. Yeah.
discussions are similar, but the emotions are boiling like three levels lower, and that that
Yeah.
that gives a lot
Yeah.
of
And
possibilities.
then Ireland, the Russophobic atmosphere is not as intense as it is in other countries, particularly in the case in Britain. And I have to say, when I live in the countryside, I speak to my kind of like neighbours and then, they know who I am, and the issue comes up. I'm rarely have I felt any kind of hostility just because I happen to have a particular view of Russia and Putin and the Ukraine war. They're interested. Actually, they're interested in someone who's continued to go to Russia during the war, and what I can tell them about what I've seen when I've been in Russia on these various
Yeah.
trips.
Well, I'm glad. Curiosity is one of the hopeful points in all of this.
Yeah,
But one thing that I want to ask you, because a question that was on my mind for the longest time, and then when the war broke out, it kind of things almost collapsed on me. Is like this: why neutrality for Ukraine never became the way to solve it? And today I understand I was naive, believing that this solving the Ukraine question would be something that's in everybody's interest. Today, I believe to understand that having a war and fighting a war was very much in the interest of certain groups of Western elites, especially in Washington and Brussels, this neocon faction. But how I always thought neutrality is the obvious way out, the obvious way to de-escalate everything, and it didn't happen. And how do you make sense of it today?
well, I think it's what's going on in Ukraine. It's the internal Ukraine situation is actually more important than the neutrality question in relation to external actors, because we're in Ukraine. Neutrality was an identity kind of issue. Yeah, yeah. Ukraine being NATO was basically Ukraine remaining detached or semi-detached from the West and attached or semi-attached to Russia. Yeah. So that's and that's why the Minsk agreements failed, wasn't it? It's because Ukrainian nationalists thought if they were implemented, that would actually that would, if in effect, preclude Ukraine's integration into the West militarily and politically. That's what happened. So that's I think that's the key explanation as to why neutrality it is the obvious solution. But the problem is a good part of the Ukrainian population didn't want neutrality because of what it signified in terms of their identity and their future. But look, I think actually I think neutrality is likely to be, well, yeah, who knows? Maybe the war will never end. Maybe it'll just all collapse in chaos. But I think I'm inclined to say that the outcome of this will be some kind of neutral Ukraine. So it will be the solution. Whether or not people in Ukraine like it, or all of them like it, or whether or not people in other countries in the West are hostile to it. So Ukrainian neutrality, is going to be the solution ultimately. So the question is, how is that going to work? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's the thing. Yeah, how is Ukraine going to be a neutral state? And I think that will be at the heart of peace negotiations if we ever get to that stage where
Yeah.
there's actual peace to go. That's going to be at the heart of that state. What does Ukraine being neutral mean? Yeah,
Yeah.
in all its complexities.
The details. One more thing that surprises me at the moment is this, by now we know that Russia, of course, has conquered parts of Ukrainian land and they're under military control of Russia. There's other lands that Russia claims that are not directly under its control yet. And then there's the rest of Ukraine. And the talk then is, at the moment, the Ukrainians are still saying like, no, we going to get all of the territories back, including Crimea, which at this point seems just insane. On the other hand, there must be calculations on the Russian side of how much territory still to militarily try to control and hold. And then this issue of like whatever is left of Ukraine, and people sometimes talk about rump Ukraine and a rump Ukraine that cannot live, that cannot survive. And I find that strange because if you look at the history of the European continent, we have seen this process quite a lot of large states suddenly becoming very small and actually being rump versions of themselves. Like, let's take Austria, right? Rump Austria today. But that Austria is very much livable and and actually the way that it's constituted today has lived happily and blissfully for the last 80 years, right? Or 70 years since the Soviets and the rest withdrew. Why do you think that a lot of people believe that a smaller rump Ukraine cannot survive when it probably would? I mean, Lithuania, Estonia, and so on, they're tiny and they are surviving.
I think, yeah, it depends on the internal situation in rump Ukraine. I mean, I think the way I think about it is that what needs to happen if you're going to have a stable peace settlement, and I think this is in Russia's interests as well as Ukraine, is that you need to have a viable Ukraine, a viable Ukraine. And I think that does mean that Ukraine gets to keep most of the territory that it currently still controls. And that includes places like Odessa and Kharkov. Yeah, I think that's that. Yeah, okay. There are degrees of viability, but if Ukraine's going to be going forward, a viable, survivable, meaningfully sovereign and independent state, that's what it means in territorial territorial terms. Okay, so the other side of the question is, it concerns like Russia's territorial ambitions or territorial claims. Okay, and the current position is constitutionally that they claim that the whole of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, as well as Crimea, are part of the Russian Federation. So it's Russian territory. And at the moment, they control 95% of Lugansk and then 70% of the other three provinces of Donetsk and Zaporozhye and Kherson. Okay, I'm going to speculate here. This is a speculation which can prove to be wrong. And my speculation is this, is that, the political military goal on the Russian side, Putin specifically, is to actually complete the conquest, occupation, liberation, depends what word you want to use, of Donetsk, yeah? And that will, to do that, will take significant military action and operations. It'll take a few months and it'll be quite costly. But it seems to me that that's what they're going to do. But once they do that, depending on the situation at the time, I think there's every possibility they might be willing to give up on occupying the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Currently, they control about 70% of those two oblasts, but the other 30% they might be prepared to give it up in the context of peace negotiation. I don't mean like give up their claim in the formal sense, but de facto accept that there will be parts of Zaporozhye and Kherson that will remain in Ukrainian hands. So I think that, and I think once we get to the point where the Russians have completed their operations in Donetsk, I think on the Russian side that will open up the possibility of serious negotiations leading to peace, but also on the Ukrainian side as well, because at that moment we get to that point, then what they're faced with is they will be faced with considerable territory losses if they continue the war, not just losing Zaporozhye and Kherson, the rest of that, but also Odessa, Kharkov, whole swathes of southern and eastern Ukraine, which are not currently under Russian control. So I think that's the point at which maybe that might be the point of a real breakthrough in diplomacy and negotiations leading to a peace. But as I said, that's that's speculation. I'm on record. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But also, of course, I suppose, yeah. Let's be a bit self-aware here. I mean, I'm speculating on that outcome, but that's also an outcome that I would see as a desirable one, or at least, yeah, more desirable than all the other possibilities we see. So, yeah. So I think that's going to happen. I think there's a good chance that will happen. That's my reading of the situation. But of course, it's also a scenario which I would welcome as being one that will bring the war to an end, short of a completely catastrophic situation for Ukraine, whilst at the same time giving the Russians what they want in terms of their security and political goals.
Yeah, and the point is, I think, also to emphasize that Russia still has this quagmire to solve, right? Is how to end the war, because I have never spoken to anyone who said Russia wants all of Ukraine. I mean, going all the way to Galicia and like swallowing the whole thing, that would be very, very dangerous for Russia, because you would invite a lot of guerrilla warfare and terrorism and so on, right?
Absolutely.
So this is something that you also want to prevent. So you need some form to wind it down at a place that makes actually also geographical and ethical and so on sense. Otherwise. And that is probably part of the negotiation that is happening or must be happening.
It's in Russia's interest that Ukraine survives this war as a viable, stable, independent state. That's what it comes down to. But of course, it's very, very difficult to see how that's going to happen. And the Russians themselves, of course, have only limited control over that outcome. Yeah. Okay, they can control how far west that they march. Or they can control what they do on their side, but they can't control what's going on inside Ukraine and in terms of Ukrainian politics. So in the end, I'm inclined to say that ultimately Ukraine's fate is going to be determined internally, yeah, but not just internally, of course, because we have these like external actors, these foreign actors are also involved in the situation. And okay, we've arrived at the situation now where the Americans under Trump are playing a constructive role in relation to Ukraine's long-term future. Okay, they want to get their own stuff out of it, this minerals deal. Yeah, but sure. Yeah. But it's the Europeans, of course. The Europeans are actually what's the word? Buttressing the Zelensky regime and encouraging Ukraine to fight on for as long as possible. And I think that European influence is a completely disastrous influence, and it could actually lead to Ukraine's complete self-destruction.
Do you think that the United States now being in a very having a tune that just Europe hasn't heard before, also with like tariffs on Europe and so on, and absolutely making it clear that the United States doesn't give a single damn about like what happens to Europe? Do you think this is now also going to change maybe the approach, like finally the way that the Europeans look at everything that's going on around them, or do you think this Russophobia still overwrites everything how they approach?
There's no evidence that in the short term there's going to be any shift. Is there at the moment? They're just carrying on. I don't know. I think maybe I think it depends on what happens on the battlefield, doesn't it? Yeah. Maybe at a certain point, if Russia's battlefield successes reach a kind of like a tipping point, whereby Russia, the whole of Ukraine could collapse in the face of its military defeat at the hands of Russia. Maybe at that point, European politicians, or at least some of them, will come to their senses and start to see things differently, and get more in tune with the American perspective on the war, which is that the war needs to come to an end as soon as possible. That there's no future in continuing to fight the war. That actually it remains an existentially dangerous war. Europeans are not there. They're still on. They're still on the previous wavelength for as long as it takes to keep the Ukrainians fighting. Where the Russians down, where the Russians down, and all this kind of like talk about the Russian threat, expansionism, and after Ukraine it'll be the Baltic states and Poland. All this kind of like nonsense. They're still in that space. Despite they might say, "Oh, we want peace, we want a peace deal," they're still in the previous kind of headspace. But maybe military events can actually precipitate a shift into a new kind of thinking in relation to Ukraine, not just in relation to Ukraine, but also in relation to Europe's relations with Russia more generally, and European security more generally.
That's the one thing. That's the one kind of reality that states can't ignore. Military reality, actually. It's a very sad realization, right? That battlefield reality at the end will sweep in, right? And even Hitler at some point had to understand that the bombs are dropping on the bunker.
Sure.
All right. Geoff Roberts, thank you very much for this discussion and your perspective on things. If people want to read from you, where should they go to get your writings?
Well, I have a website. Yeah, just Google my name, Geoffrey Roberts, and you'll see geoffreyroberts.net, my website. It's actually loads of my publications, writings are published on the website. Everything you need to know about me, or at least everything I want you to know about me, is on the website. And then the other thing, there's this thing called academia.edu. Academia.edu. Yeah, that's got a lot of other stuff I publish as well on my pages on that website, longer articles, things like that. So that's another source of my work. Yeah.
Everybody go and find.
And of course, you can always buy a copy of my books.
And I recommend it. I recommend it. Everybody go and find Geoffrey Roberts.
Paperbacks just will be published in June.
Thank you very much, Geoff.
Thanks a lot. Bye.